attitude. We are going to energise the country.
Stop Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea, is it?
Order.
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. I'm joined by my co-host, Conrad.
Hello.
And in this episode, we are delighted to welcome to the podcast a comedian, commentator and former candidate for the Brexit Party, Dominic Frisby. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
So the first question I'd like to ask you is, what do you think is funny about Brexit?
For me, where I've derived the most humour from Brexit, or what I find the most amusing about it, is the ways in which people have tried to undermine it and to deny it, and the way that they've reacted. And you see the use of straw man arguments like mad in Brexit, which is arguing with something that somebody hasn't said. And I just see straw man arguments getting used so often and so ridiculously that it's become quite comic. So, extremes of emotion that it appears to have driven people to for things that are not actually based in reality is what, I suppose, that's where I've derived the most humour from it.
Now, obviously, your most sort of famous thing, I guess, is your song 17 million F-offs, or more explicitly than that. Obviously you originally released, and then you re-released to try and get in the charts for Brexit. How did you sort of come up with the idea for that song? What sort of inspired you to sort of write that?
Well, I have I'm trying to learn the ukulele. I'm not a very good musician, and I'm trying to learn the ukulele. And I was having a ukulele lesson with my teacher, and I've always liked writing songs and rhymes and sort of comedy raps and poems and things, but I've never been much of a musician. And my ukulele teacher's a terrific musician. And we'd written, instead of having ukulele lessons, they'd sort of turned into songwriting workshops, and we'd written a couple of songs, and he always wrote them in such a way that I could play them on the ukulele. And I said to him, look, I've got this idea for another song where about all the misinformation that was perpetrated in the lead up to Brexit. Project Fear, they said this was going to happen, and they said this was going to happen, and then they said this was going to happen. And with each thing that they said was going to happen was increasingly ridiculous. And then each time they said that this or that was going to happen, the British just said F off. And so that was the sort of premise of the song. And, obviously with comedy songs, you have to sort of disguise it a little bit. If you just start going F off, F off, F off, it's not that funny. And so we had this idea of this sort of long choral, quite mournful opening, which would just be completely undercut by the word F off at the end of it. And then we were working on the lists and each time saying F off, and it actually got rather tiring. And so we found a way of doing it. And then my teacher said, oh, actually, this sounds rather like this old folk tune, which is called Uncle Tom Cobley and All. It's an old Devon folk tune. And we found that it actually lent itself. So we basically used that old folk tune and put these new lyrics to it. When you say that we re-released the song, what we actually did is I actually wrote a whole new last verse. I deleted what was the last verse, wrote a new last verse just after the general election at the end of last year. And so it was sort of like, 17 million F-offs 2.0 rather than re-releasing the same song. About half of it was the same, half of it was different.
Did you expect sort of the level of support for this song and like the popularity, or did it come as a bit of a surprise to you?
It came as a total surprise. What happened was I just tried it out one night in a comedy club along with some of my other songs, and some bloke came up to me in the audience and he just went, "Oh, that song's really good." And remember, I released it in March of last year, which was when when we were supposed to leave and didn't, and the whole thing had been derailed. And so people who'd voted to leave were feeling extremely dejected and demoralised and cheated by the establishment and so on. And so anyway, so I wrote it then, and this guy came up and he said, "Oh God, that was really good. That song, that's really good." And that was like on the Tuesday night, and I'd written it with my teacher like on the Monday, and then so I suddenly thought, actually, I'm onto something here, and this was. The deadline was March the 31st, and this would have been, I forget the exact dates, but it would have been early March. And I thought, crikey, I've got to get this made into a video so that it can go up in time for March the 31st. And so we wrote it on the Monday. I performed it on the Tuesday. We went into the studio and recorded the song on the Wednesday. It was mixed by the Thursday when we recorded the video. We made the video on the Thursday, and it was edited by the Friday. And we had it up, and it's just one of those things. When in viral videos, the way it works is you need a couple of quite influential people to sort of share it. And luckily, 3 or 4 quite influential people. One of them was Guido Fawkes, and the Guido Fawkes website, and there were a couple of others. And so without that, it's really hard. But it just caught a nerve. It really just caught a nerve at the time, and so. I was surprised, but I was also delighted.
Do you think part of the attraction with using Brexit as a comedy tool for yourself is that comedy often works best when it is subversive, and something like Brexit, both to the quote-unquote establishment, both in Parliament and in comedy, are quite opposed to that. Is that part of the reason that it attracted to you as a topic for humour?
I didn't think about it like that, but now you put it like that, I think you're absolutely right. Brexit was the people telling the establishment where to go, and so it was inherently subversive. And, there was this whole thing of giving people the vote and look what they do with it. And, so that, and again, the song was popular because it was, it was anti-establishment, basically. And so, I hadn't looked at it like that, but I think it's right.
Now, obviously, you've got quite strong sort of libertarian right-wing views. Do you think it's...
Let me stop you there. I make the very clear distinction between libertarian and right-wing. They're not the same thing.
Right, as economically right will be on a traditional spectrum.
Yeah, and socially left, and
socially left.
Right. When you start saying right wing, I think of even bigger government, and that's certainly something I don't believe in. I believe in much less government.
Right, but it's either way. Libertarianism in the view is quite different from what you'd usually find in like comedy. Often people in comedy are left wing economically and socially. So do you find it difficult to be like a comedian with sort of different political views?
Well, what happened with Brexit is quite interesting. Well, there's about 2 or 3 things there. Is that comedy itself, bizarrely, is the most, and I'm just talking about live comedy, a comedian starting out, on the circuit. Comedy is the most, if there's a more libertarian existence than that of the comedian, I'd like to know what it is. Because, it's very individualistic. If you look at the economics of comedy, it's all you have to start off doing open spot nights and new material nights and working for nothing and finding your feet. And that can be 3 years and sometimes longer of just no work at all. Now that, the idea of not being paid for your labour to the authoritarian left is horrific. So if you said, well, the reality of comedy is that you don't get paid for ages, and when you do get paid, the money's crap, and you've got to go to all these places at all ends of the country, and sometimes you don't get a hotel, and sometimes you find yourself sleeping rough, and wandering the streets at 3 a.m, and all the things that go on the live circuit. That would be abhorrent if that was a coal worker or any kind of worker was treated like that. The authoritarian left, the Owen Joneses of this world, would be going absolutely bananas. But the reality is, if you had things like, the minimum wage in comedy would just die instantly. And nobody is being forced to do any of the things. It's entirely voluntary. And they're all doing it because, there's this big carrot dangling in the sky of fame and fortune. And that's what everyone dreams of when they start out in comedy. And any kind of government intervention in the economics of this, there's all sorts of intervention at the television level, and that's why what goes on TV and what goes on the live circuit are very different things. But anyway, and you survive. Every comedian is doing all these things. He's going to these gigs and he's doing this material and he's making people laugh. Every comedian is doing that. He's acting out of his own self-interest. He wants to get better. He wants to he wants to learn his craft. He wants to eventually be performing at better gigs, in a better position on the bill, for more money. He wants to get better and better. And so eventually he can get a TV show and fame and glory and all the other things and make his statement. All the things that motivate the comedian are self-interest. And he is totally reliant on himself. In a funny kind of way, in comedy, it actually helps to have something, in inverted commas, wrong with you. Like, it helps because it gives you something individual. It gives you something to talk about. It gives you something to write about. So if you're just a sort of bland, ordinary, quite good-looking bloke with a sort of nondescript accent, in a funny kind of way, it's actually a disadvantage. When I say wrong, I mean something different about you. So that might be a really strong accent, or it might be, an unusual physical characteristic, an unusual way of looking, an unusual experience with which you come into the world. And so you'll find every comedian, particularly early on in their career, if they're slightly posh, they'll exaggerate their poshness. Or if they've got some kind of disability, they'll mine it for every kind of laugh they can. If they're, an unusual race or an unusual background or an unusual sexuality, whatever it is, they will mine it and exaggerate it. And so so as a result, on the live comedy circuit, you have all sorts of diversity. And it happens quite organically without the need for government promotion of diversity. And so it's a deeply, deeply libertarian existence. But on the other hand, most comedians, when they start commentating on the economy elsewhere, and by the way, you go to a gig and every comedian wants to be the best comic on the gig. And there's an incredible camaraderie amongst comedians. We all get on very well. We all take care of each other. We all look after each other. If somebody's in trouble, other comedians will step in and help them out. Somebody needs help with material. Everyone gives each other advice. So there's, at the same time as it being perhaps the most competitive profession there is, there's incredible camaraderie there. So as I say, it's a deeply libertarian existence. And yet, for some reason, if you suggest to comedians that, maybe the NHS isn't the best way of providing the most affordable health care to the most people at the lowest possible price, or maybe, education shouldn't be provided by the state because then it just leads to brainwashing and you suggest anything remotely libertarian like that, they think you're some kind of abhorrent individual. And so there's this real contradiction there between the actual existence that they live and the demands they make on the economy elsewhere.
I just wondered, as you've been describing the existence of a comedian, how did that as an experience differ from when you were standing as a candidate for the Brexit Party? Because I would imagine people would think they're two quite separate existences, but I wonder, did you see any similarities?
Oh, listen, that whole Brexit Party thing has been hugely exaggerated, and it's I can't talk about my experience there because I basically had no experience there. What happened was I applied to be an MEP, and this was before that election, and I thought it would be I thought it'd be fun to be an MEP. I applied to be an MEP because I was deeply dissatisfied with what was going on at that time back in March. The whole of Brexit being undermined by the establishment. So that was my initial motivation, and I could see, with the Brexit Party at that time, you felt that there was something new and fresh and vital and dynamic to it, and I was really excited and I want to be a part of that. I also thought, it's only going to be 6 months or a year, it's only going to be temporary, and, talking from my own point of view, being an MP in the European Parliament is a piece of piss because, you just turn up there, give a couple of speeches out every now and then, have some of the gravy off the train, and I thought I'd get loads of material out of this, there's loads of ways I can benefit. But the Brexit Party said, look, we'd really like you, we'd think you'd be really good, but we're too early in our evolution, and we think we think having you as a comedian on our books would just be a step too far at this stage for where we are. So I said, okay. And I was a bit disappointed, but I had to accept what they decided. And then the election came along, and I think they made the choices in like July or August it would have been. And I was just going up to Edinburgh doing the Edinburgh Festival, and they said, did I want to stand? And the guy in the next borough along from me is a guy called James Brokenshire, and you will never find a bigger sort of continuity establishment Tory. And he was the guy that basically, he's a solicitor, and he's the guy who shot Roger Scruton without looking at the evidence. So it's a deeply hypocritical thing that a solicitor would shop somebody for that New Statesman article without actually looking to see what Roger Scruton actually said rather than what he was reported to having said. So, there was a sort of slightly grudging personal thing against that guy. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. And I was going to be the candidate. And as I say, I was doing Edinburgh at the time. And in Edinburgh, you do anything you possibly can to get publicity. And I thought, if I say I'm standing for the Brexit Party, another benefit of that will be I'll get a load of publicity out of it. So I did it. And it was announced. And, I was pretty much excommunicated from the comedy circuit from doing it. My agent just stopped talking to me. And eventually we had to part company. People were writing UKIP, CUNT all over my posters in Edinburgh. And as some of the other comics were saying to me, that's only half right. And, so it was just horrible, the abuse for doing something that I think was, reasonably principled, trying to stand for democracy and all that. So I thought, I can do without this. And then my daughter's having a few problems at school, and there's a few problems with her mother, and one thing and the other. Her mum's very ill. And so basically I have to bring up the elder two kids. And I thought, I can't fight a general election. And it looked like there was going to be a general election in the autumn. I can't fight a general election, look after my kids, deal with all the abuse, try and earn a regular living in what I do anyway. I just thought it was just too much on my plate. So I stood down about a week after I'd stood up. So I can't tell you anything about, what it's like to be a Brexit Party candidate, because it really didn't get that far. But I will say this, in that short time that it was announced, the amount of abuse I got, was incredible. And I know MPs and potential MPs from all political parties take so much shit. And because they take so much shit, it reduces the amount of people that are prepared to do it. And as a result, probably you breed a certain kind of person who becomes an MP who maybe you've got to be pretty thick-skinned to be an MP, put it that way.
Now, we've just had the budget today, as of recording this, where sort of they've set out the response directly to the coronavirus outbreak that we're going through, and also a more long-term budget. What are your views on the measures announced today?
Well, I haven't actually looked at them yet, but I can tell you what they are without even having to look, because it's just so obvious what's going to happen. Now, I've talked a lot about comedy, but my other job, if you like, is I'm a financial writer. And I've just written a new book called Daylight Robbery, all about the past, present and future of taxation. My particular area of expertise is money systems. So I've written extensively about gold, about fiat money, about Bitcoin and things like that. And so, and I've become convinced that the way that once you start looking at the world through the prism of taxation, a lot of why things are as they are become very clear, and why events in history happened as they did, and why society is the way that it is now, and how the future is going to be. So I've sort of got this big grand theory that tax is the way you design a society, and the tax system in the UK is it's designed for we're living in a digital economy now. The majority of wealth and investment and everything is digital, and that tax system is designed around a physical economy that doesn't exist anymore, and about the physical movement of goods and services and physical labor in a physical world, taxing income. And there's just so many inequities and injustices and inconsistencies and in our tax system. It just needs wholesale reform. Do you know our tax code over 10 million words in length? Now, to put that number, 10 million words, in some kind of perspective, the longest novel ever written, Marcel Proust's Recherche du temps perdu, is about 1.3 million words. So it's maybe 7 or 8 times the length of the longest novel ever written. It's 14 times the length of the Bible. It's more words than most people will ever read in their entire lifetime. And that is our tax code. I promise you, there is not one individual in the whole world who has read our tax code in its entirety. And yet that is basically how the whole national economy functions. And they're right there in the design, bloated and full of inconsistencies and loopholes that the few have the resources to exploit and the many don't. And, we tax income. 50% of government revenue comes from taxing income, and then we don't tax wealth or land or anything like that in the same way. And people wonder why it's so hard for the young to get on. It's because they're taxed to death. It's really, creates so much inequality, is inherently in the design of our tax code. And it needs someone, A, who understands all of that, and B, is almost ideologically driven to reform it. And I can tell you that this new chancellor, who is, head boy at a public school, PPE at Oxford, Goldman Sachs, straight into a job as chancellor, he is not that ideological reformer. He's got where he is by being a highly competent and bright yes man. And he's got where he is by not rocking the boat, but by making sure the boat goes forward very, very smoothly. And so I can tell you that all that will have happened is some tinkering around the edges, some promises for spending on infrastructure, probably all sorts of bailout promises that involve money printing, although that's more the Bank of England to right the system with coronavirus. But basically, all that we're going to see, economic intervention by the government. And we need that like we need a fist in the face.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast. It's been great to have you on, Dominic. And I'd just like to ask one final question. If there was any piece of comedy advice you could give to yourself 10 years ago, what piece of advice would you give to yourself?
I would trust yourself, do what you think is funny, focus on that, and if you want to be a comedian, then commit to it and don't do anything else. And focus just on what you find being funny. If you were a football player or a boxer, be like a football player or a boxer who only does boxing or plays football. They have no other complications in their life. A lot of comedians, do the equivalent of learning a trade or getting a second job. I did it by becoming a financial writer. But if you really want to get right to the top, have thick skin and do nothing else.
Well, I think that's a great piece of advice. Thank you once again for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me. Can I plug my book?
Yeah, of course.
Thanks very much for having me. And if anyone, I'm on Twitter at Dominic Frisby, and that's usually the first place to find any information about anything I'm doing. But if you want to read my book, Daylight Robbery, it's the best book I've ever written. I think it will change the view you view the world, and I'm extremely proud of it. It's had amazing reviews, and you can buy it on Amazon, Daylight Robbery.